Stewart follows Kim to where your portrait hangs on a wall. He's such a haunting vision, he forgets his partner's fall.
One of the things that the Hollywood studios used to like to do during this time was heavily rely on genre, and we still see that today. Obviously we have Marvel Pictures making lots of superhero films, you have Pixar making lots of animated films, and it was certainly the case during that time. MGM used to specialise in musicals, Warner Brothers, for example, used to specialise in gangster films. And this was quite a smart thing for the studios to do, because they had the same people working for them all the time. These people, if they were always making gangster films or if they were always making musicals, they were able to churn them out quite quickly and quite efficiently and for as little money as possible, because they'd shot this type of film many times before. The actors were used to playing this particular character type, the directors were used to shooting these types of films, the costumes, the sets, they could be reused, that kind of thing. And in terms of genre, Vertigo is perhaps a slightly tricky one to classify. Lots of people would say it's a thriller. However, I think most people would agree that Vertigo is a film noir. If you haven't seen any film noirs or you don't know much about film noir, I'd recommend you to do a little bit of research on it. There are lots of videos on YouTube explaining what film noir is. And it's worth watching, I would say, two film noirs in particular. Double Indemnity, which was a Billy Wilder film, again the director of Some Like It Hot. And the other really great one to watch would be The Maltese Falcon, which stars Humphrey Bogart, who is famously in Casablanca, another film on the Component 1 Section A list from the classical Hollywood period. And whilst Paramount wasn't the only studio to make film noir, they certainly had experience with that before, most notably Double Indemnity, which many people would say is the quintessential film noir. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which Vertigo can be considered to be a film noir. This is by no means an exhaustive overview of film noir, but there's a couple of things that it does which I think are quite clear. The first is that noirs are often set in American cities, such as New York or Los Angeles, or in the case of Vertigo, it's set in San Francisco. And the second way in which Vertigo could be said to be a noir is that it includes the classic noir protagonist, that of the male anti-hero. Quite often a detective, somebody who investigates in some way, and they're quite often impotent or emasculated. If we look at the beginning credits of Double Indemnity, for example, the character of Walter Neff is walking towards the screen on his crutches, a clear sign of his masculine impotence. If we compare this to Scotty in Vertigo, he also has a walking stick at the start of the film, and he talks about not feeling like a free man because of his corset.
Well, tomorrow, the corset comes off tomorrow. I'll be able to scratch myself like anybody else tomorrow. I'll throw this miserable thing out the window. Be a free man.
Scotty also fits that classic detective mode that we see in films like The Maltese Falcon. Sam Spade, played by Humphrey Bogart, is a private detective. Scotty, just like Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon, has been hired, in this case by Elster, to investigate a mystery, that being of Madeleine Elster. What is his wife doing? What's going on with her? And in film noirs, as mentioned previously, they are anti-hero protagonists, so they tend to do things that aren't seen as being morally correct or heroic. So in Double Indemnity, the character of Walter Neff has an affair with a married woman and plots to kill her husband. And Scotty is a man who has an affair with a married woman. We see him kissing Madeleine a number of times, even though he thinks that she's married to Gavin Elster. And he isn't our traditional good guy. He's very domineering, controlling. He doesn't care about Judy's feelings whatsoever, and at the end of the film he's very aggressive and not at all what we would see as being a morally upstanding male character. Another common character type that we see in film noirs is the femme fatale, the deadly woman. And she is a very seductive and highly manipulative character who uses her sexuality and the attraction of the male protagonist to her to manipulate him in order to do something wrong for her. She will often have very evil intentions, and it's as if she's drawing the male protagonist down into this hellish world where he is being made to do things which he knows he's wrong, but he has no control over because she has such control over him.
Oh, I wish someone would kill him.
You mean kill your husband?
No, no, don't say it. You mustn't even think it. I mean, I know you love me, but I won't let you kill my husband. Although, I know you want to. We both know you want to. And then you could have me anytime you want. And I do mean anytime. Get me my cigarettes. Would you, lover? They're in my purse. Oh. I'm just so...
Whoa. That's a pretty big gun.
Oh, darling, with all this talk about killing and 45 Magnums with the clip file down and the safety off, oh, it's just all so confusing. I won't let you.
He is a dead man.
We also see that in other films like Sunrise with a woman from the city who tells the man to kill his wife. Often in film noirs, the femme fatale is a very intelligent woman, one who is able to talk and persuade the male character into doing what she wants.
I hate him. I loathe going back to him. You believe me, don't you, Walter?
Sure, I believe you.
I can't stand it anymore. What if they did hang me?
They're not going to hang you, baby.
It's better than going on this way.
They're not going to hang you because you're going to do it and I'm going to help you.
Do you know what you're saying?
Sure, I know what I'm saying. We're going to do it and we're going to do it right. And I'm the guy that knows how.
And this is one way Vertigo slightly differs, because whilst Judy is clearly manipulating Scotty in order to think that she is Madeleine Elster, in order for him to jump into the bay and rescue her, in order for him to take her to the mission, she does it by being completely silent. And this is very unusual for a film noir. Usually there's a bit of a verbal boxing match going on between the male protagonist and the femme fatale, and the femme fatale usually wins.
There's a speed limit in this state, Mr. Neff. 45 miles an hour.
How fast was I going, officer?
I'd say around 90.
Suppose you get down off your motorcycle and give me a ticket.
Suppose I let you off with a warning this time.
Suppose it doesn't take.
Suppose I have to whack you over the knuckles.
Suppose I bust out crying and put my head on your shoulder.
Suppose you try putting it on my husband's shoulder.
That tears it.
Another way in which Judy is not your typical femme fatale is that she seems to feel quite guilty and a lot of remorse for her manipulation of Scotty, something that we don't often see in film noirs.
He planned it so well, he made no mistakes. I made the mistake, I fell in love. That wasn't part of the plan. I'm still in love with you and I want you so to love me.
And finally, the narrative resolution in Vertigo is very typical of a film noir. Usually by the end of the film, the femme fatale, she will be investigated and exposed for her manipulative and her deceitful ways, and she will be punished for her actions earlier in the film. She will either die or she will be sent to jail.
Now, why did you shoot Miles?
I didn't mean to at first. Really, I didn't. But when I found out that Floyd couldn't be frightened, I can't look at you and tell you this. But oh, sweetheart, it wasn't only that. I'd have come back to you sooner or later. From the very first instant I saw you, I knew.
Well, if you get a good break, you'll be out of Tehachapi in 20 years, and you can come back to me then. I hope they don't hang you, Precious, for that sweet neck.
You're not.
Yes, Angel, I'm going to send you over. The chances are you'll get off with life. That means if you're a good girl, you'll be out in 20 years. I'll be waiting for you. If they hang you, I'll always remember you.
In the case of Vertigo, Scotty eventually figures out that all along Judy was Madeleine, and then he takes her back to the mission, he interrogates her, and of course she dies at the end of the film, thereby completing the narrative resolution of a film noir. However, one way that Vertigo diverges from the typical convention of a film noir is in terms of its aesthetic. Most film noirs would be shot in black and white, and one of the defining aspects of their aesthetic is the use of lighting, namely chiaroscuro lighting or hard lighting, and this is where the difference between light and shadow is very distinct, almost where you can draw a line around the shadow. So this is the complete opposite of soft lighting, where the line between light and shadow is very diffuse and very soft. And this is normally to represent the two sides of the character, the good and the bad, or sometimes they will use things like bars of light created by blinds, and this is to show their imprisonment in this terrible situation. However, Vertigo isn't a black and white film, obviously, but not only that, it's an incredibly colourful film. It uses things like the green fog filters in those scenes where Madeleine goes in a flower shop and you've got all of those different colours on the screen. This is something that not many film noirs would do. And also it eschews the chiaroscuro lighting, the hard lighting, and instead goes for quite a soft diffuse look. Again, we see it in the cemetery scene, and we see it in the scene where Judy finally emerges dressed as Madeline. So this is a very crucial way in which Vertigo isn't your typical classical Hollywood film noir. In terms of the shooting style of the classical Hollywood films, they were known for being shot in the tableau style, and that harks back to the visual narrative form that precedes cinema, being the theatre. And when you would go to the theatre, you would have a stage with 3 walls, the 2 sides and the back, and cinema in the early days pretty much replicated that, where films would be shot in a wide master shot, occasionally cutting to maybe a medium close-up or a close-up, but for the most part shot in one static long shot. And we can see that in silent films like Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush. And this is something that continued on into the 1950s as well, and we can see that in films like White Christmas. And the reason why studios liked this shooting style is because it was quick, it was efficient, and it was cheap. It meant that you only had to do one camera setup, only set up your lights once, you would run the scene, film it all in one take, and done. And it works particularly well for dialogue scenes. However, Vertigo is clearly not an example of a classical Hollywood film in that regard, and we see this from the very opening scene of the film. It starts in that strange, disorienting close-up of a ladder, and then we see 2 hands come into the close-up. And this is all typical of Hitchcock's highly storyboarded shooting style, where he would have lots of different camera setups. Again, we could see that in something like the Psycho shower scene. And that would be very time-consuming to do, because every time we cut from one shot to another, that's a new camera setup, that's a new lighting setup, and you're only going to get maybe a second of footage. So this would take time, and this is all due to Hitchcock's love of Soviet cinema. And he wasn't the only filmmaker to do this. Other filmmakers did it as well. But certainly if you were a director who was under contract to a studio, you would not be encouraged to do this kind of thing. You would be expected to shoot the film quickly, on time, under budget if possible. Other things that classical Hollywood films are known for doing were outlined by a film academic called David Bordwell, and he noticed several devices and systems that classical Hollywood films tended to use, and he said these created an invisible style and a sense of realism, almost as if the films are anonymous in terms of their authors, and this clearly goes against the auteur theory. So what sorts of devices and systems does David Bordwell list as being part of this invisible style, this sense of realism? Well, he points to things like objective camera work, the use of master shots, continuity editing, the use of score to heighten emotion. In terms of the narratives, he would say that they would have very logical, linear plots and goal-oriented characters. And Vertigo does follow this in many ways. It uses master shots like Ernie's Restaurant. It also uses continuity editing, where we cut on action and we aren't aware of the editing. And it also uses a score to heighten emotion. Obviously, Bernard Herrmann's score doing lots of work in the film. And yet, overall, I wouldn't say that Vertigo has an invisible style or an anonymous style. There are many stylistic devices in it that would stand out. Most notably, the use of colour, the use of the dolly zoom in that trombone effect, the use of that Soviet montage editing style that Hitchcock's known for. Even in the conventional ways, like the score used heighten emotion, the film does it to such an excessive degree that it becomes noticeable. Of the film's running time, 74 minutes of that are accompanied by Bernard Herrmann's score, and quite often without any dialogue whatsoever, and 54 minutes of the film do not have his score. And this is highly unusual for a Hollywood film to be doing at that time, I think. Another clear way that it breaks away from Hollywood films is its refusal of objective camera work. Hitchcock was known for his obsession with subjective camera work, and we see that in that lengthy sequence where Scotty is following Madeline Elster around San Francisco. As mentioned, all of these elements of the invisible style that David Bordwell said that classical Hollywood films had was to create a sense of realism, and I think this is yet another way in which Vertigo is not your typical Hollywood film. There are realistic elements to the film. It's set in a contemporary recognisable city, San Francisco. There are landmarks in there that are part of the real world. However, I think the overall tone of the film isn't particularly realistic. It has this poetic, dreamlike quality which Truffaut mentions in his interview with Hitchcock when he's discussing the film.
Because your type of logic, which often irritates the critics, is to some degree the logic of dreams.
Sure, could be. C'est évident pour I think it occurs because
Je crois que ça se passe parce que
I'm never satisfied with the ordinary.
Je ne suis jamais content de l'ordinaire.
I can't do well at the ordinary.
And we see that in the cemetery scene with the fog filters and also in the dream sequence. It doesn't particularly feel as though it's going for, again, invisible style or a sense of realism. And Bordwell mentions that classical Hollywood films have got goal-oriented characters. Well, this is true of Scotty. He has a clear goal to investigate Madeleine Elster in the first half of the film, and then in the second half of the film to get back Madeleine Elster. However, usually when we think of goals in films, it's to achieve something at the end of the film. But what Scotty is looking to do in the second half of the film is to go backwards rather than forwards, because he wants to go back to the time when he has Madeleine. And indeed, when we look at the beginning of the film, we have Scotty staring down into an abyss, and then at the end of the film, again, we have Scotty staring down into the abyss, both times looking at somebody who has died as a result of his actions. So there isn't really a clear sense of a goal being achieved like you would see in most Hollywood films. And Bordwell highlights that classical Hollywood films have simple narrative logic, and again, I really don't think this is applicable to Vertigo. The plot, quite frankly, is implausible. There are lots of plot holes in the film, and this is something that Hitchcock himself referred to as being a bit of a problem. One just off the top of my head would be the scene where Scotty goes to the McKittrick Hotel and Madeleine's character disappears. How did Judy manage that? Is the woman who works in the hotel in on it with Judy and Elster? All of these things that happen in the film which really aren't ever explained. Another plot hole in the film is never explained is how did Scotty get off the roof at the start of the film? Bordwell also mentions that classical Hollywood films are told in a linear fashion. Ostensibly, this is true of Vertigo. The film is told in a chronological linear order. However, it does it in a very strange way, and that it repeats over and over. So the start of the film, we have Scotty following Madeleine around. In the second part of the film, we have Scotty going back to those same locations again, this time on his own. And then in the third part of the film, he goes back to those locations again, this time with Judy. In terms of the regulation and the censorship of films at this time, the production code was in force, sometimes referred to as the Hays Code. And this was different to the way that films were regulated in the new Hollywood era. The production code, also known as the Hays Code, was a system whereby films were either given the okay, in which case they could be released in cinemas, or they were not, in which case they could not. And film studios would submit their scripts beforehand to get them cleared, and there were very clear guidelines on the sorts of things that films couldn't include. Overall, the main objective of the Hays Code was that films should not lower moral standards. There was a real concern at this time that films were having an effect on the morals of America, and so if you had films about bad characters doing bad things and prospering, then audiences would see that and think that those kinds of behaviours were okay. And the sorts of things that the Hays Code were looking at are still the things that regulatory bodies look at today. So those would be things like sex and violence and crime. Sex, you could not show it in any explicit way, and violence, things like blood and gore, would certainly not be allowed during this time. And in terms of criminal acts, if a character commits a criminal act, they would have to get their comeuppance at the end of the film, either to be killed or to be sent to prison. And the Hays Code specifically prohibited the sympathy of the audience being with any character who committed any wrongdoing, evil or sin. The problem was, of course, that audiences then, as they do now, love watching films that include violence and sex and criminal activity. And the other thing that was greatly undermining the Hays Code at the end of the classical Hollywood era was the increase in foreign films being shown in America. The Hays Code didn't have any say over those films whatsoever. Films from places like France and Sweden, where censorship was a lot more relaxed, it included far more explicit depictions of sex and violence and criminal activity, were being shown to American audiences, and there was nothing that the Hays Code could do about that. And Vertigo, in terms of the Hays Code, does and doesn't follow the rules. So firstly, in terms of sex, Hitchcock was often known for pushing the limits as far as he could in terms of his films, although he did mention that he didn't like his films to be too explicit in regards to sex.
Well, what turns me off are what I call all-in wrestling matches in bed. You see that all the time, you know, it's a cliche. You know, they shoot past the man's shoulder, leaning over the girl in bed, and, you know, it's just unnecessary. I think it's cheap and vulgar.
However, we do see the scene where Kim Novak is in James Stewart's bed naked. The camera makes a real point of panning past her underwear hanging up on the line, and although it's never shown, obviously, the audience is to infer that Kim Novak was stripped naked by James Stewart and put into the bed. What's even more troubling when we watch this a second time round is the implication that the character of Judy was actually awake whilst all of this was happening and pretending to be unconscious while Scotty's character undressed her and put her to bed as part of her and Elster's scheme. And then later on in the film, where we see Scotty and Judy kiss after she's had her makeover, it fades to black, and then we see Kim Novak's character in a different dress, and again in that fade to black we are meant to infer that Scotty and Madeleine have probably slept together. This is explicit as the film gets, and this would have been deemed acceptable at the time the film was made in terms of meeting the Hays Code criteria. In terms of violence, the film isn't very violent. We do see people falling to their death, but we never see any close-ups on any explicit gore or blood. It's an entirely bloodless film. One of the ways in which it clearly goes against the Hays Code is its characters and their actions. Scotty and Judy, both characters who commit acts which would have been considered immoral and illegal, and we sympathise and empathise with them at various points in the film. And the biggest way in which the film does not follow the Hays Code is the fact that Gavin Elster, a person who commits a criminal act, gets away with it at the end of the film, as far as we know. The last time we see him is during the hearing following Madeleine's death, and as far as we are aware, he's got off scot-free with killing his wife. In fact, Hitchcock did shoot another end to the film in which we hear on the radio that Elster has been caught for the murder of his wife.
Elster was last heard of living in Switzerland, but is now thought to be residing somewhere in the south of France. Captain Hansen states that he anticipates no trouble in having Elster extradited once he is found.
However, Hitchcock didn't want to include this in the film, and so it shows that actually at this time the Hays Code no longer had quite the power that it once did. So during the classical Hollywood era, many films would have been shot on the backlot of the studios. If you've ever been fortunate enough to go to Los Angeles and visit any of the studio tours there, you'll note that that doesn't really happen now. Mostly the studio backlots are used to shoot television programs and sitcoms and things like that, but back then that's where the films used to get made, and that suited Hitchcock just fine. He was the type of director who liked to have as much control as possible, and shooting on a backlot enabled you to do that. Some of the film was shot on location. In fact, 16 days of the shoot was done on location. That would have been in various locations around San Francisco, so the church and the Golden Gate Bridge, and that's all part of how the film gets some grounding in reality, even though it is quite largely a poetic and dreamlike film. But there are also instances where we see painted flats used, and scenes where it cuts to a set. So one clear example of that would be the scene where we see Kim Novak standing by the Golden Gate Bridge. That would have been shot on location by the actual Golden Gate Bridge, and then when she falls into the bay, we then cut to a studio shot where it would have been done on a backlot, and it's quite clear if you watch it that this isn't the actual San Francisco Bay, that this is in fact a set that's been built and is being used for this particular moment. Okay, so that's it for the video on Vertigo and industrial context. I hope you found that useful.